Page.
Hi everyone, thank you all for being here today. How many of you can relate to being in a conversation with someone and you're caught up in a boring story or they're telling you something that you really don't care about? As they're talking, you suddenly realize that you actually have no idea what they're talking about because the whole time they're talking, you weren't listening. If you can relate to this, then you're probably familiar with something that's all too common, not listening. Or maybe you're on the other end of the spectrum and you've been talking and you notice that someone wasn't listening to you. This is very common, but it's also a pretty big problem in communication. Studies show that when we're communicating with others, we spend about 45% of our communication time listening, whereas only 30% of that time we'll spend talking. Because of this, it's really important for us to demonstrate good listening skills. And if we're going to be a good communicator, then we have to be a good listener. Firstly, I want to make sure that we all understand what listening means. Listening is not the same as hearing. Hearing is something that happens whenever there's a sound and our ears absorb that sound. But listening is when we actually take the time to understand what someone is saying to us. It's an active process, and it requires us to take an effort to listen to whoever is speaking and to understand what they're saying. So, the key points that I'm going to be talking about today is that listening is very beneficial for us. We're going to look at some of the qualities that a good listener has, and I'm also going to give you an example of how good listening can be very important in different professions. So first we're going to be looking at the importance of listening in any business situations. Now, in businesses, people will often look for someone who is a good communicator to hire. Clear communication is key in businesses, which means that it's important to be a good listener. It kind of goes without saying, but miscommunication is a very big problem in businesses. An example of this is there was once a time where a bunch of truckers were dispatched to Portland, Oregon. They were supposed to go there to send a bunch of building supplies. Upon arriving, they learned that there's actually no supplies needed in Portland, Oregon. In fact, the supplies were supposed to go to Portland, Maine. This wasn't the truckers' fault, but the dispatcher had heard from their boss that they were supposed to dispatch the trucks to Portland, but they failed to listen to the actual state they were supposed to go to. Because of this, the company lost quite a few funds, and it was a pretty big mistake that did not really go that well. Hopefully they got that all sorted out, but as you can see, listening is extremely important in businesses, if not crucial. Secondly, I want to talk about the importance of listening in relationships. Now, you've probably all heard before that clear communication in any relationship is key. But have you ever thought about how beneficial actually listening in a relationship is? Listening is great because it helps to boost other people's self-esteem. If you're listening to someone, then you're acknowledging them. And acknowledgement means that you actually care about what they're saying. At the same time, if they're listening to you, you would feel that acknowledgement as well. So it's really good for your relationships. It also can help relieve your stress because when you're listening to someone, you can balance your emotions by actually absorbing what they're saying and taking time to think. Likewise, it helps us to learn because we can understand what they're telling us and see a different point of view. So really, listening is helpful for both us and the person that we're listening to. Lastly, listening is very important in different professions, especially ones where you're required to show empathy. And as an example for this, I interviewed Pastor Trent Thompson, who's a local pastor here in the Waikoloa area. He specializes in youth ministry and has over 20 years of experience. As a pastor, he says that communication is a very big part of his role, but the most important part of communicating to him is listening. He says that it's very important to be an empathetic listener, which means that you have to actually put yourself in someone's shoes to understand what they're going through. Empathetic listeners are often more understanding because instead of just listening to someone and waiting for them to stop so that you can put your input in, you actually take time to look at their body language and understand what they're going through. By putting yourself in their shoes, you're trying to understand them and also empathize with them, because you don't really know the emotions they're going through unless you're putting time into listening to them. It's also important to be open-minded. Pastor Thompson said that as a pastor, he'll encounter people with many different views, and it's important for him to not try to force his view upon them, but help them to understand where he's coming from while also listening to them and what they have to say. To summarize, there's a few key points of listening I want to talk about. First of all, listening is active. Where hearing is a passive thing that happens naturally, listening is something that we have to actually put intent and effort in. It also requires eye contact and makes us engage with our audience. We have to actually understand the person and approach them without judgment and be open-minded. This all can help us be more understanding to whatever they're trying to tell us. As I finish up, I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope that you have learned something new and can apply these new listening skills into your life. Something I learned from this is that oftentimes I hear more than I actually listen, and going forward, I hope that I can become a better listener. Thank you.